Story 9. The Missing Codex. He checked his watch, 9:27 p.m. The date? July 2nd, 2017. His lamp battery was diminishing. Blood seeped through the makeshift bandage on his thigh. He removed his climbing gear and tossed it to the frozen mountaintop. Edward Croft, a professional rock climber, had tested himself to ascend the famous Craggy Rock. Tales of gold artifacts and diamonds hidden at the summit. This Goliath of a climb fired the adrenal of many climbers to be the first. A compulsion to reach the top for every climber, with greed more a factor than climbing for passion. Many had failed, never making it past the halfway point. Edward had trained hard for this day. It had took him 2 days and nights, finally reaching the top. He was the first to make it. He hoped to find the riches he deserved, but only to be greeted with a large hold entrance at the peak, leading down into the heart of the mountain itself. How can this be? How could man have possibly tunneled a hole through the summit into the mountain? It was way too high and way too narrow to bring mining equipment to the top, Edward questioned himself. He sat on a frosted rock at the entrance to the tunnel and adjusted the ligature on his thigh. There's no way of making it back down, not with the injury. I'm going to have to take the tunnel down. There has to be a way out, Edward contemplated. He looked around. Sharp gusts of wind shook the ice crystals from his matted black beard as he took in the magnificent views of the surrounding mountaintops. He removed his backpack and began to pack away his climbing gear whilst taking a blast of his oxygen supply. His last can was registering 13%. If he used it sparingly, he would have 4 hours supply, not enough to descend the mountain. Even without the injury, it was impossible. He now knew he had no option but to take the tunnel. Edward pulled the strap tight on his rucksack and made his first steps inside the entrance cautiously. The mouth of the tunnel's interior was a smooth circular opening, as if bored out with a tunneling drill, 12 feet in diameter. He was bewildered by the way this was. It did not seem man-made. He clambered unsteadily. Further down through the tunnel, loose rocks tumbled underfoot, echoing off the walls as they bounced down into the dark chasm. There was no going back up to the entrance. The pain in his thigh was accelerating. Edward began to sweat. He tapped on his lamp. It flickered, giving him a little more illumination for a second, then back to its low beam. His view limited to under 2 feet, as the energy from the batteries depleted some more. He stopped and looked around the walls of the tunnel. His lamp illuminated his surroundings. Edward reached to the right-hand side pocket of his rucksack and produced an emergency flare. He ripped off the top, causing the flare to spark and burst into a bright red glare, now lighting up the tunnel walls around him. Edward first noticed strange markings on the walls, plastered all around him. The markings looked very similar to the ones he had studied in college. The Dresden Codex, the oldest surviving book from the Americas, dating to the 13th or 14th century. He could not decipher its meanings, but the artwork was amazing. Edward moved the flare to the left and right of the tunnel walls before moving the glowing red flame toward his feet that were unbalanced under the loose rocks beneath him, or what he thought were loose rocks. He dropped the flare from his hand in shock as he noticed the tunnel floor consisted of hundreds of human skulls, trailing down into the dark chasm of the tunnel. Each skull looked as though they had been polished clean. Edward froze. Breathing heavily, he looked back towards the tunnel entrance. He rubbed his hand over his forehead with frustration. He had no option but to carry on forward. Picking up a piece of wood from the tunnel floor, he used it as a crutch as he made his way forward once more, navigating his way through the pathway of skulls. His lamp now flickered, nearing complete depletion. His bandage on his thigh was now soaked and dripping with blood. Edward fired up another flare and noticed the pathway of skulls now leading into the belly of the cave, which consisted of a sea of human skeletal remains, all of which were also polished clean. There were an array of clothing mixed in between the skeletal remains. He noticed an open-circuit oxygen system and a pair of reindeer skin boots to the left of him. Edward was dumbfounded. He was not the first to climb the rock. The year was now 2018, and the equipment that he had found dated circa 1953. Alongside these artifacts was at least a kilo rough-cut bar of pure gold. He quickly stuffed it into his rucksack, along with scriptures that he had recognized once before on his trip to the Saxon State Library in Germany, scriptures illustrating hieroglyphs. He now realized that the remains inside the cave were where other climbers had succumbed to a grisly end. His lamp now fully depleted of its battery, rendering total darkness. It was at that point Edward heard a vibrating, humming sound coming from the entrance to the tunnel. Something was heading his way. He sensed danger and was filled with fear of the unknown. Edward could just make out a place to hide and quickly shuffled over to a crevice in the cave wall and used the skeletal remains around him to cover himself. Edward watched as a bright blue light beamed down into the tunnel, causing him to squint with the brightness. It lit up the cave exponentially. Edward inhaled sharply with surprise as he saw the cave in full light. There were hundreds, not just climbers. There were also child skeletal remains. The vibrating hum grew louder as it moved further down the tunnel slowly. Edward's breathing became irregular. He began to feel faint with the loss of blood. He began to feel faint with the blood loss from his thigh. Edward reached into his rucksack and produced a clean roll of bandage, unwrapped the blood-soaked one from his thigh, and replaced it with the fresh one. The bleeding was subsiding as he tightly wrapped the dressing with the fresh one. The bleeding was subsiding as he tightly wrapped the dressing. The object entering the tunnel seemed to stop just before the mouth of the cave. The vibrating hum echoed eerily off the cave's walls. It was still out of view from Edward's standpoint. There was about 15 seconds of silence. There was about 15 seconds of stillness. Just the object's hum invaded the cave before the object let out a sound. That could only be described as a single L-porn. Before the object let out a sound that could only be described as a single L-porn. Edward threw his hands onto his ears. The sound was immense. Edward threw his hands onto his ears. The sound was immense. After around 10 seconds, the horn stopped. From the back of the cave, bones slowly started to displace themselves. Something was coming from below. Edward pulled a few more bones around him in hope to cover himself completely, avoiding being detected by the object and whatever was coming from below. It was now reaching the top of the sea of bones. The skeletal remains toppled downwards from the mound this being was creating as it made its way to the top to greet the object. Edward's heart pounded, watching as it reached the top. A hideous and grotesque-looking figure, the size of an elephant, crawled its way out of the top of the mound of bones. It seemed to be covered in a slime of some kind. An elongated, scaly gray head with a thin neck writhed around on the torso of a scaly body. Its arms, thin and withered, reached out to the object, which now had started the L-porn once more. Its arms, thin and withered, reached out to the object, which now had started the L-porn sound once more, as if in acknowledgement of the arrival of the being. Lasting another 10 seconds before it stopped. The creature let out a high-pitched scream, seemingly communicating with the object. It was then 2 human corpses began to levitate directly towards the creature along the blue light the object was projecting. The creature squealed in a kind of excited way, thrusting its arms back and forth, awaiting the meal the object was delivering. The creature swiftly clawed the 2 cadavers out of mid-air. Pinning them down, in return, the creature produced the largest diamond Edward had ever seen, the size of a football. Into the beam of light above it. It too levitated toward the object, and out of the sight of Edward. The creature began to tear away at the clothes of the dead, ripping its way to bare flesh as it began to devour its prey. Edward moved slightly, trying to adjust his laying position in the crevice, hoping to catch a glimpse of the object in the tunnel. He jumped as the beam of light turned off, and the hum of the... He jumped as the beam of light turned off, and the hum from the object started to dissipate. A sonic boom sound echoed off the cave walls as it turned to pitch black once more. Edward froze in panic. He could hear the creature gnawing away at its meal, slurping and chewing. Its cobalt blue eyes were all Edward could see as he listened. At that point, the stack of bones covering him slipped away, crashing down into the belly of the cave. The creature stopped eating quickly and gazed towards Edward. He lay motionless, shaking with fear. It felt like a lifetime as he locked his stare towards the creature's eyes. It felt like a lifetime as he locked his stare toward the creature's eyes, awaiting its next move. It turned away and carried on eating. Edward lay silent for over 20 minutes before the creature had finished, then burrowing its way back down from below where it had come from. Edward lay silent for over 20 minutes before the creature had finished, then burrowing its way back down below from where it had come from. He quickly scrambled down from the crevice, still in pain from the wound on his thigh. Reaching into his rucksack, he produced another flare and quickly lit it up. Edward shone it toward where the creature was positioned. It was gone. All that remained was steaming fresh polished bones on top of the pile it had been feasting. He had no option but to go back up the tunnel. And try to descend the mountain. The south side of the mountain was mainly vertical, so his idea was to rappel seated down the majority of it. The flare had lasted the 20-minute climb to the entrance of the tunnel. Edward tossed the flare over the edge of the mountain, then dropped onto his knees with sheer exhaustion. The top half of his leg felt numb. A sharp, cold wind whipped around the mountaintop. Edward checked his watch again. 11:27 p.m. He had spent 2 hours down there. A dark, overcast night, the moon shone through the gaps in the cloud structure every now and again as the cold air enveloped Edward. Composing himself, he sluggishly opened his rucksack, pulling out his gear and oxygen, probably just enough for the descent he had in mind, although very dangerous. Securing his rappel harness, he tied a rescue 8. Through his figure 8 descender, placed his oxygen in his holster, and placed the breathing mask over his face. He lightened the load considerably in the rucksack, wrapping the gold bar in a fresh jumper that was inside, and rolling up the 27 pages of scriptures before making the first step off the edge. It was then the mountaintop lit up. The object had returned. Its deafening Alphorn sound infiltrated Edward's ears, causing him to throw his hands over his ears, which in turn caused him to jerk off the mountaintop. About a foot before his equipment locked on. Its deafening Alphorn sound infiltrated Edward's ears, causing him to throw his hands over his ears, which in turn caused him to jerk off the mountaintop about a foot before his equipment locked on, stopping him from free fall, but slamming him against the jagged rock wall, cutting open the top of his eye. Edward panicked as he quickly tried to start the rappel down, feeling dizzy in the process. The object hovered around the side towards him. Dangling from his ropes, Edward turned to see the craft behind him. It was hard to see a full view, as the bright red lights that flashed around the cigar-shaped object blinded his sight. A blue beam of light, the same as the creature encountered, illuminated Edward against the rock wall. He felt weightless as the rappel rope snapped free. At that point, Edward was rendered unconscious. He felt weightless as the rappel rope snapped free. At that point, Edward was rendered unconscious. His vision was blurred. A bright white light engulfed his eyesight. A bright white light engulfed his eyesight. Dark, shadowy figures hovered above him. A loud hum invaded his ossicles. Filled with fear, his heart pounded as he once again slipped into unconsciousness. Filled with fear, his heart pounded as he once again slipped into unconsciousness. The sound of steady beeps from the ECG machine to the side of Edward brought him round from his sleepy state. An IV was attached to his arm, administering plasma. A nurse calmed him as he tried to jump off the bed in panic. "It's okay, Edward. Calm down. You've been in an accident," said the nurse sympathetically. "What?" replied Edward, confused. "You were found at the foot of Craggy Rock. You are a very lucky man, Edward, sir. You're a very lucky man, Edward. Air paramedics say you fell at least 250 feet with only a scratch on your head," said the nurse as she adjusted his bed sheets. "Where's my rucksack?" whispered an exhausted Edward. The nurse opened the bedside cupboard and produced the item. Edward grasped it from her quickly. He rummaged through the pack with haste, pulling the jumper that was wrapped around the gold. Only there was no gold. The scriptures were also missing. He threw the rucksack to the polished white hospital floor and shouted towards the nurse. "Where is it?" "I don't know what you mean, sir," replied the nurse, bemused. Edward's manic demeanor had forced the nurse to press the emergency buzzer, alerting 2 male doctors to the room. One held a syringe filled with haloperidol. Edward struggled as the 2 doctors held him down. Once again, he drifted into unconsciousness as the doctor administered the calming jab. He was talking in his sleep again. Didn't sound like any language I know. Just gobbledygook, said the nurse now, connecting the IV back into Edward's arm, which had been knocked out during the struggle. "Okay, nurse. Please keep your eye on him. We're still running tests on how it was possible for his survival." "Okay, nurse. Please keep your eye on him. We're still running tests on how it was possible for his survival," said the doctor as he wrote down his signature and the date, July 15th, 2017, on his medical chart. This was his 3rd day at the hospital. He had been missing for 10 days. The nurse checked the ECG before making her way to the door of the intensive care room, switching off the light before leaving. Edward lay silent, enveloped in deep sleep. Behind the lobe of his ear, underneath the layers of his skin, lay a microscopic gold transmitter that was emitting radio waves, inaudible to the human ear, and that was beyond any technology that Mother Earth had ever encountered. Inaudible to the human ear, and that was beyond any technology that Mother Earth had ever encountered. And that was beyond any technology that Mother Earth had ever encountered.